The man's voice was sharp and raised as he jabbed his hands towards the little girl. "Kids like you are reckless and disrespectful. Who even allowed you into this park? You don't belong here." Soon a crowd began to gather. Phones were raised, whispers turned into audible outrage, and the tension in the air grew thick enough to cut. "What kind of man hits a little girl?" A deep voice from the crowd demanded sharply. "Before we start the story, ensure you click the subscribe button now and tell us where you are watching from. If you love stories like this and want to know what happened, keep reading." It was a sunny weekend at Greenfield Park, the kind of day that brought families and friends together to bask in the warmth of the sun. Children laughed on the playground, couples strolled under the shade of oak trees, and cyclists whizzed by on the park's winding paths. Near the basketball court, a group of teenage boys played an animated game, their shouts and laughter blending into the park's vibrant symphony. Gary, a middle-aged man whose demeanor and behavior reflected years of unchecked anger and prejudice, sat on a wooden bench near the court. His physical appearance mirrored his personality, stout and gruff. His newspaper was folded neatly beside him, and a cup of coffee rested in his hand. He wore a frown, as if annoyed by the very existence of joy around him. His sharp eyes darted at every sound, every movement with disdain. To Gary, the park was no sanctuary. It was an intrusion into his solitude, a reminder of a world he felt no longer understood him. He muttered under his breath about the noise, the crowd, and how things used to be. A basketball bounced wildly across the court and rolled toward Gary's bench. One of the teenage boys, a tall, lanky white boy, chased after it. As he grabbed the ball, he accidentally brushed against Gary's arm. "Sorry about that," the boy said quickly, his voice polite but hurried as he jogged back to the court. Gary glared after him but said nothing, muttering under his breath, "At least he belongs here." The boy's apology, or maybe the color of his skin, had been enough to diffuse Gary's irritation for now. Maya, a 9-year-old black girl with a smile that could brighten the darkest day, rode her pink bike a short distance away. She wobbled slightly as she turned the handlebars, still learning to balance without her training wheels. Her mother, Lisa, watched from a picnic blanket nearby, her book forgotten as she kept an eye on Maya. Lisa's gaze softened as she saw her daughter stop to help a much younger child who had dropped their ball. "That's my girl," Lisa murmured to herself, pride swelling in her chest. Maya waved at the child and hopped back onto her bike, her laughter trailing behind her as she rode toward a shaded corner of the park. There, a man with a weathered guitar sat cross-legged on the grass, strumming softly. His music was slow and thoughtful, adding a gentle undertone to the park's lively sounds. Maya stopped her bike near him, captivated by the melody. She clapped her hands when he finished, her face lighting up with excitement. "That was amazing," she said, digging into her pocket and pulling out a crumpled dollar. She handed it to him with a big smile. "This is for you." The guitarist's eyes widened with surprise and gratitude. "Thank you, young lady," he said. "You've got a kind heart." From his bench, Gary watched the interaction with a sour expression. "Parents these days don't teach their kids any sense," he muttered to himself. "Talking to strangers, throwing money around. They don't know better." His muttering grew louder, catching the attention of Lisa, who had been watching Maya from a distance. Lisa frowned, noticing Gary's glare. Something about his expression unsettled her, but she chose not to confront him. Instead, she pulled out her phone and sent a quick message. "Park's busy today. Can't wait for you to join us." The reply came almost instantly. "Be there soon." Lisa smiled, reassured. She glanced back at Maya, who was now riding her bike again, heading toward the open paths near the benches. Gary's irritation boiled over as Maya approached. He couldn't explain why her presence bothered him so much. Perhaps it was the joy she exuded or the way she carried herself. Or maybe deep down, His prejudices ran far deeper than even he cared to admit. Maya's laughter echoed through the park, a joyful sound that blended with the hum of families picnicking, children playing, and dogs barking in the distance. But her joy became the catalyst for something darker when she unknowingly brushed against Gary's shoe with her bike pedal. As Maya's bike neared his bench, she wobbled slightly. Her balance faltered, and the pedals scraped against Gary's shoe. Startled, she jumped off the bike, clutching the handlebars tightly. Gary stood abruptly, his face twisted with anger. "What's wrong with you, kid?" he barked, his voice so loud it silenced nearby chatter. Maya's eyes widened in fear. "I'm sorry, sir," she stammered. "I didn't mean to—" "Sorry?" Gary interrupted. "Kids like you always think you can do whatever you want. No respect for other people's space." Maya froze, tears welling in her eyes, as Gary's words sliced through her. Park-goers began to notice the commotion. Lisa saw the confrontation from a distance and immediately stood up, her heart racing. She started walking quickly toward them, her protective instincts kicking in. Maya tried again, her voice shaking. "I didn't mean to hurt you, sir. It was an accident." "Accident?" Gary snapped. "People like you are always causing accidents. Maybe if your parents taught you some manners, this wouldn't happen." Was Gary right to judge Maya just by a little mistake? Click the subscribe button if you believe Gary was wrong. Only those who believe Gary was right won't subscribe. Gary stood abruptly, his face contorted with anger. Pointing a trembling finger directly at Maya, he yelled, his voice sharp and cutting through the park's peaceful ambiance. Maya froze, her smile fading as fear clouded her wide eyes. She stammered an apology, her voice barely heard. "Kids like you are reckless and disrespectful. Who even allowed you into this park? You don't belong here." His finger jabbed toward her face as he loomed over her small frame. Parkgoers nearby began to take notice. Conversations hushed, and heads turned toward the growing commotion. A jogger paused mid-stride, frowning as he watched the scene unfold. A mother pushing a stroller stopped a few feet away, muttering under her breath. "He's always like this." Maya's fear deepened, her small body trembling under Gary's imposing glare. She tried to explain again, this time crying, her voice breaking. "I'm really sorry. It was an accident." But Gary refused to let it go. His anger burned hotter, fueled by something far uglier than just a scraped shoe. He muttered something under his breath, something venomous. And then his voice erupted again. "Accident? I don't care if it was an accident." The jogger, sensing the situation escalating, stepped forward cautiously. "Hey, man," he said, his tone calm but firm. "She's just a kid. Take it easy." Gary turned sharply, his anger now redirected. "Mind your own business," he snapped. "This has nothing to do with you." The jogger held his ground, glancing briefly at Maya, who was now clutching her bike and fighting back tears. The jogger's voice softened, almost pleading. "Come on, look at her. She's scared. There's no need for this." But Gary's anger only grew. He waved his arm dismissively, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, sure, let's all just excuse bad behavior. That's what's wrong with this world. People like her." His words trailed off into something even more vile, something that caused audible gasps from the gathering crowd. Before Maya or anyone could react, Gary's rage boiled over. He raised his hand and struck Maya's face with a sharp slap, telling her to keep quiet. The force knocked her off balance, and she fell to the ground, clutching her face as tears spilled down her cheeks. The park froze for a moment. There was only silence, broken by Maya's soft, pained cries. Then came the gasps, the murmurs, the frantic sounds of people reaching for their phones to record the incident. Maya's mother, Lisa, already walking from a distance, sprinted toward her daughter, her face a mix of panic and fury. "What is wrong with you?" she shouted, her voice echoing across the park. She knelt beside Maya, cradling her in her arms and checking her for injuries. Maya, through her tears, whispered something to her mother, her voice so soft that only Lisa could hear it. "He punched me," she said, her words tinged with fear and pain. Maya's tiny frame crumpled to the ground, her cheek red and swelling from the force of the punch. The joyful chatter of the park fell silent, replaced by the shocked gasps of bystanders. She clutched her pink bike, her knuckles white as tears streamed down her face, mixing with the dirt on her cheek. Lisa's jaw tightened. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone, her fingers moving quickly over the screen. If you were in Lisa's shoes, what would you have done? Click the subscribe button now to get justice for Maya and Lisa. Lisa's expression was one of barely contained rage, but her voice remained calm as she spoke softly to Maya. "It's okay, baby. Your father is coming." Gary, meanwhile, showed no sign of remorse. He doubled down, waving his arms angrily as he addressed the crowd that had now formed around him. "She should have stayed out of my way," he shouted. Kids these days have no respect. None! The jogger, still standing nearby, pulled out his phone and began recording. Gary noticed but didn't stop his rant. If anything, the attention seemed to fuel his arrogance. "Go ahead," he sneered. "Record all you want. I'm not the bad guy here. She's the one who caused this mess." Lisa's hands shook as she finished typing a message and hit send. Her voice was calm, almost chillingly so, as she looked up at Gary. "You're going to regret this," she said, her tone steady but filled with quiet menace. Gary scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "Yeah, right," he muttered. "Regret what? What, telling the truth?" Lisa didn't respond. She stood slowly, her gaze unwavering as she watched him. The park-goers, now filming from various angles, murmured among themselves. Some whispered words of outrage. Others speculated about who Lisa had just contacted. As the tension grew, one thing became clear. The day's events were far from over, and Gary, for all his bluster, had no idea what was coming next. Some parents hurried their children away, whispering to them softly, but others began inching closer, curiosity and concern etched on their faces. Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. What happened? Did he hit her? That's a little girl. Gary, standing a few feet away, crossed his arms defiantly, his face flushed with anger. "This is ridiculous," he spat, his voice rising. "She ran into me." What was I supposed to do? Just let it happen? The crowd grew larger. A group of teenagers from the basketball court wandered over, their game forgotten. Among them, a tall, middle-aged man stepped forward, his expression darkened as he looked from Maya to Gary. "What kind of man punches a kid?" he asked, his voice steady but carrying a dangerous edge. Gary turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "Stay out of this," he snapped, his tone sharp and dismissive. "You don't know what happened here." The man took another step forward, his gaze unwavering. "I don't need to know the details. I saw enough. You hit her." Gary threw up his hands, his frustration bubbling over. "She was being reckless. She scraped my shoe with her bike. Look at this." He pointed down at his scuffed sneaker as if the small mark justified his actions. "Kids like her think they can do whatever they want. Someone needs to teach them some discipline." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A woman holding a stroller shook her head, her voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "He's always like this. I've seen him yell at people before, especially if they are black. This isn't the first time." Gary's eyes darted around, realizing the crowd was turning against him. He tried to leave, taking a step back toward the path, but before he could retreat, Lisa and the rest of the crowd stepped into his path. Lisa's expression was calm, almost eerily so, but her eyes burned with quiet fury. "You're not going anywhere," she said, her voice low and steady. Gary scoffed, trying to push past her, but Lisa didn't move. "Move out of my way," he demanded. "I've had enough of this nonsense." Lisa folded her arms, her gaze locked on his. "No," she said simply. Gary, clearly rattled but unwilling to admit it, shouted again. "You're all blowing this out of proportion." "She's the one who ran into me. I was just defending myself," Gary insisted. His words only fueled the crowd's indignation. Several people had their phones out now, recording the scene. A woman's voice could be heard in the background. "Did you call the police?" she asked. Another bystander replied, "Yes, they're on their way." Gary heard this exchange and rolled his eyes. "The police?" he said with a bitter laugh. "Great. Let's waste their time over this nonsense." Lisa didn't respond to him. She knelt down beside Maya, her movements careful and deliberate as she checked her daughter's face. Maya winced, but didn't pull away. "It hurts, Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. Moments later, a police car pulled up near the edge of the park. Two officers stepped out, their expressions serious as they approached the crowd. Gary smirked, his confidence returning. "Finally," he muttered, "some real authority." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. "He hit her," someone said. "This is unacceptable," another voice chimed in. As if on cue, the officers arrived. They walked toward the crowd with an air of authority, their hands resting on their belts. The park-goers parted to let them through, their phones still trained on the scene. Gary's confidence swelled as the officers approached. "Finally," he said, his tone dripping with relief. "Someone who can bring some sense to this madness." The officers began asking questions, but their tone noticeably shifted when they spoke to Gary. One of them, a middle-aged man with a stern face, listened to Gary's version of events with nods of apparent agreement. "She ran into me," Gary explained, his voice growing louder with each word. "I was just defending myself. I didn't do anything wrong." However, when the officers turned to the jogger and the guitarist for their accounts, their questions were curt and dismissive. "Are you sure you saw what you think you saw?" one of them asked. "It's easy to misinterpret situations like this." The jogger bristled. "I know what I saw. He hit her." The officer's expression remained neutral, but his tone turned dismissive. "We'll handle it." Maya's mother, Lisa, stood protectively over her daughter, her hands trembling as she held her phone. She watched as the officers seemed to side with Gary, their questions to him polite and measured, while their responses to the witnesses were curt and skeptical. Were the officers right to side with Gary simply because he's white? Click the subscribe button if you believe they were wrong. Only those who love their prejudice won't subscribe. Finally, one of the officers turned to Lisa. "Ma'am," he said, his tone firm, "we're not going to escalate this. It looks like an accident that got out of hand. Let's all calm down." Lisa's voice was steady but icy. "He hit my daughter," she said, her words sharp and deliberate. "And you're telling me this was just an accident?" The officer glanced at Gary, then back at Lisa. "It's best if everyone goes their separate ways. What would you do when the very ones meant to protect you are blinded by their prejudice?" Lisa's jaw tightened, and her hand gripped her phone tightly. Without a word, she began typing a message, her calm demeanor unnerving in its intensity. Gary smirked, emboldened by the officer's apparent support. "See?" he said, spreading his arms. "Nothing to worry about. Let's all move on." But Lisa didn't move. She finished typing and looked down at Maya, her voice soft and steady. "Daddy's coming." "You're safe now," she said. The tension in the air was electric. The crowd murmured as they watched Lisa's calm resolve. "Who is she texting?" someone asked, Why is she so calm? Suddenly, a faint sound began to rise in the distance, a low rhythmic hum that grew louder with each passing second. The park-goers turned toward the entrance, their attention shifting as the sound became unmistakable. Sirens. One by one, black and white police cars pulled into the park, their lights flashing but sirens silent. The vehicles formed a line, their engines rumbling as they stopped in unison. The doors opened, and officers began stepping out, their movements purposeful and deliberate. Finally, a sleek black SUV pulled up behind the police cars. The driver's door opened, and a tall man in a perfectly pressed uniform stepped out. His presence commanded immediate respect. His shoulders were broad, his expression unreadable, and his aura was one of absolute authority. The murmurs in the crowd turned into whispers of recognition. "That's Chief Jackson, the chief of police," someone said. "He's Maya's dad." Chief Jackson walked toward the scene with an air of authority and measured steps, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before settling on his daughter. His expression softened briefly as he saw her, but the fire in his eyes remained. Lisa stepped aside, her face a mixture of relief and restrained anger. "She's right here," she said. Chief Jackson knelt down beside Maya, gently lifting her chin to inspect the red mark on her cheek. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Maya nodded, tears still glistening in her eyes. "I'm okay now, Daddy," she whispered. Jackson knelt down, inspecting Maya's tear-streaked face. His voice remained calm and steady, but his eyes burned with a quiet fury. Maya's small hand reached to touch her cheek. "He hit me," she whispered. "I didn't do anything wrong, Daddy." Chief Jackson's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice gentle. "I know, baby. You don't have to worry anymore. I'm here." He stood, turning his full attention to Gary. The crowd grew silent, their phones still recording every moment as Jackson approached the man who had assaulted his daughter. "You," Jackson said, his voice sharp and deliberate, each word landing like a hammer. "Tell me exactly what happened." Gary's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His confidence, which had been so brazen only moments ago, evaporated under Jackson's piercing gaze. His hands fumbled at his sides, and he stammered, I didn't mean to—" "Speak clearly," Jackson interrupted, his tone unwavering. "What did you do to my daughter?" Gary's face reddened as he struggled to form a coherent response. She was reckless," he finally managed. "She ran into me with her bike. It was an accident, and You hit her," Jackson said, cutting him off. "You hit a 9-year-old girl. Is that what you're trying to justify?" Gary's lips trembled, his words faltering. "I was defending myself," he blurted out, his voice rising in desperation. "She scraped my shoe. She needs to learn—" "Learn what?" Jackson snapped, taking a step closer. "That adults like you can attack children and call it discipline? That's your excuse?" Before Gary could respond, a voice from the crowd rang out. It was the jogger, his phone still recording. "He's lying," the jogger shouted. "I saw the whole thing. She didn't do anything to him." Another voice joined in. It was the guitarist. His quiet demeanor gave way to anger. "He slapped her across the face. There was no accident. He lost his temper because she was a black kid having fun." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as more witnesses began to speak up. "He's always like this," a woman with a stroller exclaimed. "I've seen him yell at people here before, but this is the worst." The teenage boy from the basketball court stepped forward. "I bumped into him earlier by accident, and he didn't react like this to me. But the moment she got close, he blew up. He's just a bully." Gary's head darted between the speakers, his face growing pale as the crowd turned against him. He raised his hands in a futile attempt to defend himself. "They're exaggerating," he said, his voice shaky. "It wasn't like that. She—" Enough, Jackson said, his voice slicing through Gary's excuses. You've been caught, not just by witnesses, but on camera. He gestured toward the phones held up by multiple park-goers. Your actions speak louder than any lies you try to tell. Gary took a step back, his eyes darting to the initial officers who had tried to let him go. They said it wasn't a big deal, he exclaimed, pointing at them. They said I could leave. The crowd gasped, and Jackson's eyes narrowed as he turned to the two officers. Their discomfort was visible as they exchanged uneasy glances. Is that true? Jackson asked, his tone cold and cutting. Did you dismiss an assault on a child because you believed him over the witnesses? The older officer cleared his throat, struggling to maintain his composure. We were still assessing the situation, he said weakly. We didn't have all the information. You had plenty of information, Jackson shot back. You chose to ignore it. He stepped closer, his presence towering over them. That ends now. Both of you will report back to the station for an internal review. We don't tolerate negligence in this department. The officers nodded reluctantly, their faces flushed with shame. The crowd murmured in approval, their faith in justice beginning to be restored. Gary, realizing his safety net had crumbled, tried one last desperate lie. I didn't know she was your daughter, he said, his voice shaking. If I'd known. Jackson's expression darkened, and his voice dropped to a low, dangerous tone. It shouldn't matter whose child she is. No one deserves to be treated the way you treated her. The weight of Jackson's words settled over the park, silencing Gary completely. The crowd watched as Jackson gestured to his officers. Take him into custody, he ordered. Charge him with assault and add hate crime enhancements. Let the court decide his fate. The officers moved quickly, handcuffing Gary as he sputtered weak protests. This isn't fair. I didn't mean... His words were drowned out by the murmurs of the crowd and the sound of cameras capturing every angle of his arrest. As Gary was led away, Jackson turned back to Maya, his expression softening as he knelt beside her again. Are you ready to go home, sweetheart? He asked. Maya nodded, her tears finally drying as she looked up at her father. I'm ready, Daddy. Jackson lifted her into his arms, holding her close as he carried her toward the SUV. The crowd parted to let them pass, their whispers filled with admiration and relief. He did the right thing, someone said. That little girl is lucky to have a dad like him. As Jackson placed Maya gently into the car, he turned back to the crowd one last time. His voice was firm but carried a note of gratitude. Thank you to everyone who stood up for my daughter. It's because of you that justice was served today. The park grew quiet as the line of police cars began to pull away, their flashing lights fading into the distance. But the memory of what had happened lingered, a powerful reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed, would always find its way. Meanwhile, the video of Gary's assault on Maya had already gone viral. Parkgoers had captured the slap, the crowd's reactions, and Chief Jackson's commanding arrival. Within hours, the footage had spread across platforms, igniting a firestorm of online debates. The hashtag number Justice for Maya began trending, accompanied by clips of the incident and heartfelt messages of support for the young girl. The online outrage soon spilled into the real world. By the next day, protesters began gathering at the park, holding signs that read, "End hate now" and "Protect our children." Local news crews arrived, broadcasting live interviews with witnesses and activists. One reporter spoke to the jogger who had stepped in during the altercation. "This isn't just about one incident," he said firmly. "It's about holding people like Gary accountable and making sure our community is safe for everyone." The park, once a quiet sanctuary, was now a battleground for change. As the video continued to circulate, Gary's life began to unravel. His workplace learned of the incident through the footage. the CEO of the company issued a public statement condemning Gary's actions, announcing his immediate suspension pending further investigation. Neighbors began speaking out as well. "He's always been unpleasant," one woman said during a local interview. "He'd yell at kids who played too close to his yard. I even heard him say some nasty things to delivery drivers. But this is beyond anything I could have imagined." Another neighbor described years of tension. "We always knew something wasn't right with him," he admitted. "But after seeing what he did to that little girl, I can't stay silent anymore." Gary's isolation grew as the stories mounted. The world he had tried to dominate with his arrogance and cruelty was now turning against him, piece by piece. In the weeks that followed, the park underwent a transformation. What had once been a scene of injustice became a symbol of resilience and unity. Community leaders organized events to celebrate diversity, inviting families of all backgrounds to come together. Maya, now more confident than ever, returned to the park with her family. She rode her bike along the same path, greeted by cheers and waves from other park-goers. The jogger, the guitarist, and even the park ranger were there, offering her words of encouragement. Chief Jackson, standing proudly beside Lisa, delivered a powerful statement to the gathered crowd and reporters. "This isn't just about Maya," he said, his voice resonating with conviction. "It's about creating a world where no child has to fear being themselves, where kindness and respect are the norm, not the exception." The crowd erupted in applause, their voices united in a call for justice and change. The park, once tainted by Gary's actions, had become a place of hope and strength. Maya's story, though painful, sparked a movement that reminded everyone that even in the face of hatred, courage and unity could prevail. The park remained a hub of activity, not with conflict, but with purpose. Volunteers gathered to restore the park's peaceful atmosphere, planting flowers, repainting benches, and hanging signs promoting kindness and inclusivity. Families returned, bringing their children, who now felt safe to play without fear of hostility. In court, Gary faced his charges with no one to defend his behavior. Witnesses, including the jogger, the guitarist, and even the park ranger, testified against him. Their accounts painted a clear picture of a man whose unchecked anger had finally caught up with him. The court handed down a sentence that included community service and mandatory participation in anti-bias training, ensuring he would face his actions and learn from them. The park became a gathering place for conversations about justice, unity, and growth. Weekly events brought families together to celebrate diversity. Picnics, music festivals, and storytelling circles that encouraged empathy and understanding. Maya, always at the center of these gatherings, became a voice for change despite her young age. At one such event, Maya stood on a small stage next to her father, holding his hand tightly as she addressed the crowd. Her voice, though soft, carried strength beyond her years. "I was scared that day," she admitted, her eyes meeting those of the children in the audience. "But my daddy told me that we don't have to stay scared. We can stand up even when it's hard." The crowd applauded, wiping away tears. Chief Jackson stepped forward, his hand on Maya's shoulder. "This park has become more than a place to play," he said, his deep voice resonating across the space. "It's become a symbol of what we can achieve when we come together. Hate thrives in silence, but love and courage can overpower even the loudest voices of fear." If you love this story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share for more. See you in the next one.